Hello, my name is Brianna Brooks, and my presentation is on minority voter turnout. I will be comparing two U.S. Senate elections to see if more minorities have better political participation when there are other minorities running for an elected office. I would like to get into some minority voting history before I get into what my research paper is about. In 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment giving African American men the right to vote. In 1896, Louisiana is the first state to pass the Grandfather Clause. The Grandfather Clause prevented former slaves and their descendants from voting. This act dropped the registered black voters from 44.8% to 4% within 4 years. Four more states created their own Grandfather Clause to have the same success as Louisiana. Those other states that introduced the Grandfather Clause was Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, and Virginia. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that all racial groups in the U.S. are entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. This includes all groups, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, as well as African Americans. In 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1960. This act established federal inspection of local voter registration rolls and introduced penalties for anyone who obstructs a citizen's attempt to register to vote or cast a ballot. Things that were like this was poll taxes that I'm going to talk about next, literacy tests where they would give tests that are impossible to pass because African Americans didn't have any education, so it was hard for them to read, and so that outlawed all of that. In 1964, the 24th Amendment is created to outlaw poll taxes. In 1965, voting rights protests took place. This was like the march from Selma, and Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, banning and barriers to racial and ethnic minority political participation. This created 2,500 registered new black voters just by this itself. I will be focusing on the minority U.S. Senate history because my paper more or less focuses on the California U.S. Senate history elections, and that's the data that I do look at later on. So November 3rd, 1868 is when John Menard was elected to Congress in Louisiana. Although he was never seated because of disputed election results, so he was not considered the first African American to win a seat in the Senate because they never seated him. Now, the first African American to serve in the Senate was in 1870. And from 1870 to present day today, only 10 African Americans have served in the Senate. The first Asian American to serve in the Senate was in 1959, and there has been 8 total up until today. The first Hispanic American to serve in the Senate was in 1928, and there has been 9 total today. And the first Native American to serve in the Senate was in 1907, and there has only been 3 Native Americans to serve in the U.S. Senate. I think all this is great information to know because there has not been that many seats for minorities in our U.S. Senate. So just to see these minorities here, and there has only been 10 African Americans, 8 Asian Americans, 9 Hispanics, and 3 Native Americans, I think that's very important to note because it just shows where our minorities stand when it comes to the U.S. Senate. Now for the main focus of my research. I believe that minority voter participation is more likely to increase in the political process if a candidate is running who is of minority status as well. So, for example, that would just be me saying if an African American candidate is running for an elective office, more African American minorities, or even Mexican American minorities, Hispanics, or Asian Americans will be more likely to vote for that African American minority that's running because they are as well a minority. I plan to look at the 2016 California U.S. Senate election versus previous elections for the same Senate seat. I will compare minority voter participation from that previous election where there were no minorities to the 2016 one where there were two women minority candidates running for the same seat. So, the 2016 California U.S. Senate election. It was versus Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez. So I'm just comparing the two candidates and giving some background history on this slide. So Kamala Harris is of Jamaican and Indian descent. She was formerly a district attorney of San Francisco in California in 2003. And then she ran for Attorney General of California and she served from 2010 to 2017. After that, she decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat in California when the incumbent decided they were going to retire and the open seat became available. She ended up raising $2.5 million for her campaign. She ended up winning the California U.S. Senate election in 2016 with 62% of the vote. She won 54 out of the 58 counties in California. She was running against Loretta Sanchez. Loretta Sanchez is Mexican American. She served in the House of Representatives for 20 years, from 1997 to 2017. She raised $1.6 million for her U.S. Senate campaign, but she ended up losing the 2016 election with only 38.4% of the votes. Both of these ladies are minorities who were both running, and it's different from the people who were in her spot, the senators who were in her spot before, because they were both two women who were not minorities. Here I am looking at the exit poll results for the 2016 California U.S. Senate race. This is good to be compared to my next slide, which focuses on the exit poll results of the 2010 California U.S. Senate results. And these results shown here, Kamala Harris won 67% of the white vote, 79% of the black vote. She did not win the Latino vote, but she did win the Asian American vote. Sanchez, on the other hand, did win the Latino vote with 53%. On the other side of the slide, I break it down by race and gender. And it shows Kamala Harris won the white men and women vote, and then she split the Latino men vote with Sanchez, and then won the other votes. The biggest takeaway for me on this slide is the percentage of the races that did vote. So it shows that 47% of white people voted, 6% of black people, 33% of Latino, 11% Asian, and 3% other races. That's going to play a huge part in my next slide when I break it down and figure out my results to see and compare if more minorities voted here or if they voted in the 2010 election when there weren't two minorities running. This is a slide for the exit poll results for the 2010 California U.S. Senate election. I also decided to break it down by vote by race and the vote by race and gender. But what I'm going to focus on specifically is the total amount of people that voted. If you look in the vote by race under total, 61% of white people voted, 9% of African American people voted, 22% of Latinos voted, 5% of Asian Americans voted, and then the other is still 3%. And the other chart also breaks it down. My results for the test is that based on the exit polls from 2010 to 2016, it shows that Latino voter turnout did have a huge increase in voter participation. It rose from 22% in 2010 to 33% in 2016. The white voter turnout went the opposite way and went from 61% in 2010 to 41% in 2016. I think this could also test my hypothesis because the white voter turnout went down, and in this race in 2016, there were two minority candidates running for the U.S. Senate seat, and there were no white candidates running. The Asian voter turnout rose from 6% to 11%, and I think that would also have something to do that there was 2 minority candidates to choose from. So the Latino and Asian voter turnout did increase, with majority 53% of Latinos voting for Sanchez and 70% of Asians voting for Harris. I wish it was easier to test since both of these minority candidates were Democrats, if that played a role in the minorities voting for them, because in the 2010 election, one was a Democrat and one was a Republican. Barbara Boxer, the Democrat, did end up winning with majority of the vote, but in this case in 2016, they were both Democrats. Now, what I can say is that minority voter participation did rise, especially within the Latino and the Asian American community. As for the African American vote, it seems it stayed the same but lowered a little bit because I think there was no African American candidate running for them to come out and show more support, which I think should be something that should be worked on. But as for the Latino and Asian voter turnout, they did increase a lot.